this is Dr. Burton, and today we're going to be covering the history of philosophy timeline. This is something I created in the context of my ethics class. It can be used in other contexts, like the broader history of philosophy, and it's part of a larger project that I'm working on, but I made this for my ethics students because in the ethics class we study many different secular and non-secular ethical theories, and usually we want to know what's the context of all of these theories. How did we get them? And so this is a timeline that helps us to see two different aspects of the history of philosophy. So at the top you can see there are logical options, and I've come up with this schema. It's not the only way of looking at the history of philosophy, but it is a way that I'm looking at it. It's interesting to me, and I'm developing this in a larger history of reason context. So the logical options have to do with reason and being, or logos and ontos. And reason in this context is the laws of thought. Aristotle believes the laws of thought are also the laws of being. So when we think about what is, what exists. And to say reason is ontological is to say that there is an isomorphism or a fit between our minds and what is out there in the world. And this is where thinking is grasping the nature of reality. Okay, so in the history of philosophy, the first philosophers begin with thinking about being. And so this is the first logical option. Historically, it's also the first option. And it says reason is ontological and there is no God, meaning a theistic God, God the creator of everything. So these first philosophers, which we'll see historically on the left-hand side going down, this will be the historical figures and beliefs going down, but across the top are logical options in the history. So the first philosophers think that reason does apply to being. Reason grasps the nature of things. Things have a nature, but there is no theistic God. And so they're going to be speculating about how reason can apply to being. How is there order in the world? So this is thinking, epistemology, and metaphysics. But remember, this is in the context of an ethics class. So thinking about being, and once we have a theory about the nature of being or reality, our metaphysics, then we build an ethical view on the basis of our metaphysics. Remember, metaphysics also includes our view of human nature, and ethics is about how humans can live the good life, or what is the good, or what ought I to do. All right, so the first is reason is ontological, there is no God. The second logical option, and I think the second historical development logically, is that reason is ontological, so thinking applies to being, and God, the theistic God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam exists. Okay? The third movement and the third logical option is that reason is not ontological, reason does not apply to being, and the theistic God exists. And we'll have to see, why did they make that move? How does that come about? And then the fourth movement is that reason is not ontological, reason does not apply to being, and God does not exist. Okay, so these are the logical options. I'm calling this the logos of history because it's about the logos, the order in the world, and where that order comes from. So there is order in the world, but it doesn't come from God. There is order in the world, it does come from God. There may be order in the world, but we can't really know it. And if there is, it comes from God. There's no order in the world, and if there is, we can't know it. And there is no God. Okay, so those are the four options. Now, think about how each logical option might develop an ethical system, because that's really what we want to talk about. Now, these historical eras, I'm calling this the history of the logos. So the top logical options, the logos of history, the logic of history, how it goes through logical options, and the historical eras are the history of the logos. And the logos is the search for the logos in philosophy. The search for the logos is this search for an understanding of the fit between thinking and being. Okay, so how does each thinker deal with that question? And so you can see they have a little arrow, and the arrow points to which logical option this thinker falls under. And as you go down the timeline, you can start to see a movement historically from the first category to the second category to the third category to the fourth category. And we are currently living in an era that's dominated by that fourth category. So I am not going to go through every thinker, but I'm going to show you how to read this timeline. Okay, so this is the history part. Ancient philosophy. Now we can argue over dates, they're approximate, and some people love to argue about this. I'm not super interested in the details of dates, but the feel of the era or the thinking of the era. All right, so ancient philosophy starts in 545 before Common Era BC and ends in 430 AD. And these are the main figures, not the only figures. Someone will want to dicker with me about who I picked and why. I picked these figures for their being prime originators of ideas, and some of them I picked for their ethical views. So these first philosophers, Thales is said to be the first philosopher. Now, over here you can see EMP and MM. At the bottom of this timeline, there is an abbreviation key. So let's look at this. First, the first thing that's listed for each philosopher is their epistemology. Generally speaking, you can dicker with me too over whether I've gotten these right. I've mostly got it right. Then their metaphysics is listed, and then their ethics is listed if there's an abbreviation. Otherwise, it's just spelled out. All right, so epistemology, there's rationalism, empiricism, authority. Those are abbreviated. If it's something else, it's spelled out. Metaphysic, MM, means material monism. Dualism is dual. And then you could see these other abbreviations. So that's the key. So if you're looking at this saying, what is all that? You have that key at the bottom. So the first philosopher in the West. Oh yeah, I should mention, this is Western philosophy. I'm not sure this schema works for non-Western philosophies, but I would invite someone doing Chinese philosophy or Indian philosophy to try it out and see if it works there too. Because humans go through logical options, I wouldn't be surprised if these logical options show up in other world philosophies as well. It's just my hunch right now, though. And if you think my schema isn't accurate, I think you can test it empirically. I'm going to test it empirically by adding more people to this list and seeing where they end up. So we can see, is there a general pattern to the unfolding of the logos of history or the logic of history? And we can do that by adding more people to this list and seeing what the dominant ideas are of the eras. Okay, so here we start with Thales. He is a material monist, so MM. He thinks that all that exists is matter, and he's also an empiricist, which means all of our knowledge is through the senses. Empiricism is one of the major epistemologies in the West, and rationalism is its alternative. And so a lot of times the history of Western philosophy is contrasted between empiricism, all of our knowledge is through the senses, and rationalism, all of our knowledge is through reason. And some times there's a variation on what that means. But these first philosophers, and there are more we could fill in here, were all empiricists and materialists. Heraclitus was a philosopher who thought that all is matter and all is changing. Matter is always constantly in motion and it's always changing. He got into paradoxes in his mind because he thought if everything is changing, then nothing is permanent and nothing is knowable. And yet we observe this order. How is that possible? Parmenides had an alternative view. He thought everything is matter, and because all is one thing, he's a monist, all is one, then motion is not possible, change is not possible, it must be an illusion. And if what appears to us is an illusion, then we really can't know. And so by the end of this first, 250 years of philosophy, they ended in skepticism, which says no knowledge is possible. No knowledge of the world is possible. And so the next phase is going to be a time of skepticism where the sophists start to come on the scene. Now I put Protagoras here, but Gorgias is another sophist, and there are others, and they thought knowledge is not possible. They still, so you can see this is going way over to this other side here. He's the first, maybe. They are, the sophists are the first to propose this. All is matter and it's in flux, and our senses don't deliver knowledge of reality, and we can't know the material world. He's also going to be a sort of relativist when it comes to ethics. Ethics is relative to the perspective of the individual, and a pragmatist. And so the sophists were rhetoricians. They wanted to use words, use language. Their emphasis was on language, and language to persuade people through emotion to get power. And so you can see this is under the category reason is not ontological. Our thoughts don't get to being, and there is no God in this view. So it's a shift from the first view of reason is ontological, but you can see how they got there. They're being more consistent. Now, philosophy could have ended there, because if we can't know anything, why continue this search for the logos, which is a search for the truth about reality? But Socrates and Plato and Aristotle are going to give us the next round of thinking. Now they are still in this category of reason is ontological and God, the theistic God, does not exist, but they're going to give some tools that further the conversation towards moving into this second phase, second logical option. So let's look at what they thought. So Socrates is more of a rationalist. All of our knowledge is through grasping the forms of things. And Plato develops that. He's a rationalist. The mind is grasping the nature of reality. So reality has a nature, and instead of material monism, they're dualists. They think matter is eternal, like the previous philosophers, but they also think humans have a soul. And the soul is the self-aware thinking part of us. It's also where the emotions are and the will is. It's called faculty psychology, where the human is a rational animal, and the rational part includes your intellect, emotion, and will. And so the permanent part of humans is the soul, and the permanent part in the world are the forms. And now Plato and Aristotle differ over those, and we probably don't need to talk about that difference for the purposes of our discussion. But I think, I put rationalism here for Aristotle. he's probably a rational empiricist, so he's not the same as Plato and Socrates. He thought that our senses do deliver some knowledge, but he really develops logic and metaphysics, and he is the first to write an ethics textbook. So he writes the Nicomachean Ethics. Now we can start talking about ethics. Prior to Plato and Aristotle, ethics wasn't fully developed by philosophers. They were looking at nature. They were more of naturalists. But Plato, in his Republic, is looking at the nature of justice. What is justice? And Socrates is looking for the good life. And so they start to give us some vocabulary for doing ethics. These three I'm going to call teleological ethicists, where ethics is based on human nature. So in line with reason applies to being, reason applies to human beings. Human beings have a nature, and that nature is that we're rational, and Aristotle would add political animals. And because we're rational animals, we can know what is good for a rational being and what is evil for a rational being. So it's good for humans to use their reason to know reality, to know what is true and what is beautiful and good. And it is bad for humans to fail to use reason, to know reality, and to know the good and the beautiful, and to fail to be virtuous. So we get the three main categories of ethics from the discussion that we read in Plato's dialogues and Aristotle's ethical writings. He also writes about politics, and they both write about the political realm and the polis, or the city-state, and what the best city-state is. But Aristotle gives us the concepts of the good, virtue, and happiness, and it does seem like he puts the emphasis on virtue. And so we get a tradition of virtue ethics coming from Aristotle. I feel the need to put in some Christian thinkers because they do a lot of thinking about ethics and the good life, and we don't often treat them in an ethics class in the secular academy, but that's just because we do ethics in the secular academy from this fourth column in this era down here, the postmodern to now. But there are some rich discussions, and I haven't even included as many as I could have included here, but I start with St. John, who is the Apostle John, who writes the Gospel of John. And I include him here because in this search for the Logos that the first philosophers are involved in, St. John in his Gospel has 18 verses at the very beginning called the prologue, where he addresses this search for the Logos. And I'm just going to tell you about it because this is helpful for understanding Christian ethics, or ethics from general revelation, which is a view that God exists and we could know God. It's clear that God exists, and it's clear what human nature is, and we can figure out what is good for humans based on that nature. So you can take some ideas from the existence of God that's clear to all people, and human nature being created by God, and derive a natural moral law. So we're going to have a natural law tradition coming out of Christianity, and a natural moral law that is maybe not fully developed but could be explored a lot more. And so this is St. John talks about in the beginning was the Logos, the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So this is an eternal personal being. And he talks about the Logos is in man as the light, and that light is reason, that by which humans understand. So he establishes humans are rational, there's a Logos in humans. And the Logos is like the formal cause. He also says the Logos is in the world and was made, the Logos, the world was made by the Logos. And this Logos in the world is the natural laws of creation, like what science studies, and the moral law in human beings that can be derived from human nature. So this is definitely in that tradition of reason is ontological and God exists, and it's probably establishing that tradition. Now he also talks about the Logos is written as scripture, and the Logos is incarnate as the Christ. And this is because the Logos in humans and the Logos in the creation have been rejected. And God wants to redeem humans from the moral evil that results from the rejection of the Logos in themselves and in the world. So maybe we'll talk about that when we talk about the moral law, the natural moral law. Okay, so that's a move from this first category, reason is ontological and there is no God, to now there is a God, and now the Logos in the world and in ourselves is grounded in the reality that God created, and that's why it's there. Previously, they couldn't really explain it, and then they explained it in the soul and in the forms. Then Aristotle rejects the forms, and it gets a little skeptical from there. So John seems to be answering this question that the philosophers before him have. Now, there's also another tradition that is in this first column that does not have the theistic God. It does influence Christianity, though. It's the Stoics, or the Stoic tradition. Now, there are a lot of different Stoic philosophers, and there are a lot of different there are differences among them, but generally speaking, they're rational empiricists. Some are empiricists, some are rationalists, and they do think reason applies to being. They're generally speaking naturalists or material monists, and they do develop a system of ethics called Stoicism, and we will talk about that more. So a new ethical theory coming from Stoicism, and it's really about the struggle with suffering. How do you deal with suffering in a noble way? Okay, we'll talk about that. And then at the end of this era, some people put Augustine in the medieval period. I don't know if it's arbitrary or not. I put it here because this is the fall of the Roman Empire, and if you see, there's another person I could have put here, Boethius. He doesn't really do ethics, so I didn't put him on here, but he is the means of transferring the knowledge of this previous era to this next era. And you could see there's a huge gap here between 430 and 1034. This is because this is the fall of the Roman Empire, and the West enters a stage of intellectual, political, economic turmoil, and the intellectual tradition in the West is preserved mostly through the institution of monasticism at this time, which is a religious institution. And I just don't see how that fits into the ethics class, although it is a very interesting period, and we could, put a lot more detail in here. So Augustine is the last in this first period. He is living at the end of the fall of the Roman Empire, and I put him on here because he is kind of the first in a tradition that's going to be called divine command theory. Now, I'm not convinced that he fully endorses this view, but divine command theory says that we should we know God's will through scripture, not through a natural moral law. Now, I'm not saying Augustine fully endorses that, and he may be a transitional figure. He may be a little bit unclear about what the good life is. My friend who does philosophy at ASU, I asked him about this, Dr. Anderson. He said that Augustine thinks the love of God is the good. Now, I will leave that there. He's not a figure that we're going to really study, but we will study this tradition of divine command a little bit. Now, I'm going to pause the video for now so that we can take a breather and come back and do the next period. And the next period is going to be the medieval period, and the modern period is after that. All right, I will see you in the next video.